close your eyes and let the fire's glow fade into the darkness. Somewhere far from the safety of cities and stone walls, where the wind whispers through dead branches and monsters walk unseen, there travels a witcher, a slayer of beasts, a man without fear, or so the songs claim. But tonight's contract is not like the others. Tonight, even a witcher hesitates. In the north, where roads forget their own names and the forests lean close to listen, a notice hung on a post that no hand would tear down. It stood outside a tavern whose sign had once shown a black boar. Wind and rain had worried the paint into a blur of tusk and shadow. The post marked a small square, trampled mud, crooked stones, a well hooded in moss. By day, Grey Hollow looked half abandoned. Yet at dusk, thin smoke rose from chimneys, and when fog rolled in from the marshes and pooled between houses like spilled milk, shutters closed one by one with careful hands. The notice was charcoal on parchment, the letters pressed hard. Contract. Grey Hollow. Disappearances. Reward in coin and grain. Speak to Elder Wylam. Someone had added beneath, no jesting. And below that, scratched by another hand, witchers came, witchers left. Inside the tavern, the air smelled of wet wool, smoke, and old ale. Candlelight clung to tables and did not reach the corners. Men spoke as if sound itself carried risk. If anyone asked about the notice, only fools asked directly. Someone would shrug and say, "It's there." There had been witchers, not long ago. The first was lean and sharp-eyed, with a medallion shaped like something snarling. He read the contract, asked how many had gone missing and whether blood was found. When the elder answered, "No blood," the witcher's mouth tightened. He asked one more question, almost casually. "At night, do you hear anything?" Elder Wylam, bent, pipe-stained, steady as an old fence, answered, "No." The witcher stood very still. Then he said, not like kind of silence, and walked away. He took no coin. A month later another came, broader in the shoulders, with a wolf's head on a chain. He stayed 2 nights. He walked the village edge at dusk while the fog crawled across the fields, then asked to be shown where the missing had last been seen. He studied the ground, frowned, and said nothing at all. At dawn, he was gone. After that, the contract became a warning. It began, they said, with a miller's son sent out at dusk to fetch a goat straying too close to the fog line. He did not return. In the morning, the goat stood at the yard's threshold, bleeding softly, its rope neatly cut. There were no tracks leading away, no prints in the mud, not even the boy's own. Then it happened again. A washerwoman at the stream before sunrise, a charcoal burner with his cart, a wounded soldier who stopped for one night and vanished between door and stables. Grey Hollow counted them in a stubborn way, as if numbers might form a fence. 6, then 8, then 10, always the same. No scream, no struggle, no blood, only absence, and a change in the nights. On windless nights, when fog rose thick, the village became muffled, as though wrapped in wool. Dogs would not leave the hearth. Chickens huddled and did not fuss. Men woke certain they had heard something, then realized it was the opposite. They had heard nothing at all, where there should have been creaking timber, dripping water, an owl's call. Elder Willem tried to keep order. He set lanterns at corners, posted watches, told folk to travel in pairs, but every measure fell thin. In the quiet moments, someone would say, barely above a whisper, "If witchers want," and no one finished. Villagers learned small habits. They poured salt lines across thresholds, though none could say what salt would stop. They kept candles in every room, because flame was a comfort when the air felt damp and listening. They stopped whistling in the street. They stopped telling the old jokes that ended with a shout. In the mornings, the world returned in pieces. Frost might rim a bucket. A cart would creak somewhere beyond the fog. Yet even then, the village felt as though it waited for night to remember what it had forgotten. Some claimed they heard footsteps in the mist, never close enough to place, never steady enough to follow. Others swore the fog itself moved wrong, gathering in hollows where wind should have scattered it, slipping through cracks like a living thing. Once, a hunter fired an arrow at a pale shape among the trees. The arrow vanished. The hunter came home shaking and would not hunt again. They tried priests too. A traveling priest of the eternal fire arrived, spoke loudly of sin, and swung incense until the tavern reeked of it. The next morning his horse was found saddled, reins tied neat, with the priest nowhere at hand. After that, no one spoke of priests as a solution. So the contract stayed up, not because anyone believed in it with hope, but because taking it down felt like inviting the problem to become permanent. The paper, the ink, the nails, these were small acts of defiance, but better than bare skin. And always, when the night came and the silence settled, folk remembered the detail that frightened them most. The Witcher's questions. Not about tracks, not about claws, not about blood, but about sound. As if sound were proof that a thing belonged to the living world. One evening, when fog came early, and the tavern filled with the damp stink of travel, the door opened and a stranger stepped inside. He was tall enough to make the lintel seem low, yet he carried himself without lordly ease. His cloak was worn, boots stained with road. Rain clung to him in small beads that shone in candlelight. When he pushed back his hood, pale hair lay tied simply at his neck, and his eyes were too light in the dim, too watchful. At his throat hung a medallion, not bright, not polished, but heavy and shaped like something made to bite. The tavern held still. Geist stopped mid-roll. Even the fire seemed to settle lower. The stranger walked to the board by the door and read the contract once. Then, without hurry, he read it again. "Elder Willem," the Witcher said, at last, voice low and rough with cold air. "Where is he?" "At his house," the innkeep managed. "Sir." "I'm no sir." "The missing," the Witcher went on. 10. Aye, 10. No bodies." The Witcher was silent a heartbeat. Then he asked the question that tightened the room like a drawn strap. "At night, do you hear anything?" "No," the innkeep said, and the word broke slightly. The Witcher's mouth set into a line, not fear, but calculation. "Good," he said. He set a coin on the counter. "For a room." As he turned toward the stairs, he spoke once more, simply as instruction. "Sleep with candles. Lock your doors. Don't go outside if you think you heard a voice." He paused. "Especially if you think you didn't." Then he went up, boards creaking beneath his weight. For a long moment after he vanished, no one spoke. At last, someone exhaled. "He's taking it." Outside, Grey Hollow lay under fog like a burial shroud, and the notice on the post, damp and curling at the edges, "I finally found a reader who did not turn away." The Witcher left the tavern before dawn, when Grey Hollow still clung to its last hour of false safety. Fog lay thick upon the fields, pressed low and unmoving, as if the night had forgotten to lift it. Frost silvered the edges of fence posts. The well rope hung stiff and quiet. No rooster called, no dog barked farewell. He did not hurry. Witchers learned early that haste was a luxury for men who believed the world predictable. The continent was rarely that. He walked first along the village boundary, boots sinking softly into damp earth. His medallion rested cold against his chest. It did not tremble, It did not hum. That told him little. The fog beyond the last cottage felt denser, not thicker in sight, but heavier in presence. Sound dulled. Even his own footfalls seemed reluctant to echo. He paused at the place the miller's son had last been seen. There were no tracks. There had been rain days ago, enough to soften the soil, yet the ground lay undisturbed. No sign of struggle. No scuff heel. No drag marks. He crouched and touched the earth. Cool. Ordinary. It yielded to his fingers like any other patch of mud. Nothing hidden beneath. No sinkholes. No illusion glamours rippling at his touch. He rose and continued outward, toward the marshland that curved around Gray's Hollow like a bent spine. The marsh breathed faintly in the morning chill. Reeds whispered their wind should have moved them, but there was no wind. Pools of stagnant water reflected the pale sky without ripple. A crow perched on a dead willow branch, silent. The Witcher stopped. He waited. Crows were not silent at dawn. He tilted his head slightly, listening past the surface quiet. No insects buzzed in the reeds. No frogs stirred in the shallows. The marsh, which should have been thick with small living sounds, felt held. He stepped forward. The crow did not startle. It did not fly. It simply watched him with one dark eye. His medallion gave the faintest tremor, not a full vibration, only a brief tightening, as if reacting to something too subtle to name. Magic, then. But not fresh magic, not the sharp tang of a curse recently cast, not the pulsing heat of a specter tied to unfinished grievance. This felt older, thinner, spread wide. He walked deeper along the marsh's edge, boots finding stable ground by instinct. Once a thin branch cracked beneath his heel, and the sound seemed louder than it had any right to be. Still no birds answered. He reached the tree line, beyond the reeds. The forest there was sparse, pine and birch spaced unevenly. Moss grew thick along roots, undisturbed by grazing deer. He saw no droppings, no wolf prints. It was wrong. Animals did not abandon territory without cause. He knelt once more, examining a faint scuff near a trunk. Not a footprint, not exactly. More disturbance of leaf litter in a shape too vague to hold meaning. He brushed it aside gently. Nothing beneath. He closed his eyes briefly, letting his hearing stretch outward. Witchers did not possess sorcerers' gifts, but mutations sharpened what was already human. He listened for breath, for heartbeats, for movement too small for untrained ears. He heard his own pulse. He heard distant water shifting in a marsh pool. He heard nothing else. That silence pressed against him in a way that claws never did. Claws belonged to something living, something that hunted because hunger demanded it. This felt like absence with intention. He opened his eyes. A faint scent lingered on the air, cold, metallic, not quite blood, not decay either. It reminded him distantly of old crypts where stone had held moisture for centuries. Higher vampire? No, he had known their kind before. Higher vampires carried presence like gravity. They moved among men unseen, yes, but not unheard by the world itself. Rats fled them. Cats hissed. The air shifted when they fed. This was different. There were no drained bodies, no punctures, no feeding, only vanishing. He moved farther north, toward a shallow rise where an abandoned stone marker stood half swallowed by moss. He traced its carving, a sigil once meant to ward minor spirits. It had been placed there long ago, likely when Grey Hollow was first settled. The sigil was worn thin, and beneath it, faint but real, lay another mark, not carved, but etched in ash or soot. A circle, broken deliberately at one point. Binding, not protective, containing. The Witcher studied it without touching. Someone had drawn that mark years ago. The lines were faded almost to invisibility, yet the shape remained intact enough to hold meaning. Binding magic did not endure without anchor. He straightened slowly. The fog shifted, not blown, shifted. It gathered in a shallow depression between trees, pooling unnaturally where ground rose slightly. He watched it with measured calm. From within that pooling mist came no shape, no sound. But for a moment, brief as a blink, he felt watched. Not with hostility, with awareness. His medallion tightened again, faint as before. He exhaled slowly and stepped back from the depression. If it were a specter, it would manifest. If it were a curse tied to a person or object, there would be a focal point, an anchor of grief, betrayal, blood. This had none of those signatures. He walked until the forest thinned and the marsh widened again. The day had brightened, though sunlight barely pierced the fog. Behind him, Grey Hollow remained small and still. Ahead lay only damp earth and reeds bending in air that did not move. He stopped once more and turned in a slow circle. The silence was not empty. It was restrained, like a held breath. The Witcher had known monsters that tore flesh, monsters that seduced, monsters that whispered in borrowed voices. Each left signs consistent with their nature. Each obeyed certain patterns, however cruel. But this thing, whatever it was, did not behave like hunger. It behaved like erasure. He glanced toward the village again. 10 gone. No remains, no cries, no tracks, no blood. Only silence where sound should have been. The crow in the willow finally lifted its wings and flew, not away from him, but in a wide arc, avoiding the marsh's center, as if that space itself offended instinct. The Witcher watched the bird until it vanished into fog. Then he turned back toward Grey Hollow. Investigation would not begin in reeds. It would begin in stone. Old houses, old stories, old mistakes. Binding magic rarely existed without a reason. And if someone had bound something near this marsh long ago, then the contract was not about slaying a beast. It was about unmaking a decision someone had once believed wise. He walked back slowly, boots leaving clear prints behind him. When he reached the edge of the village, he paused once more and listened. From within Grey Hollow came the ordinary sounds of day. Distant chopping wood, a door creaking, muted voices. Yet beneath those sounds lingered that same restrained quiet, as if the land itself were listening for a misstep. He entered without ceremony. The contract had been accepted. But the thing that waited beyond the fog had not yet decided whether it welcomed his presence or simply noted it. The Witcher did not mistake that distinction. He did not fear easily, but he respected what he did not yet understand. And in Grey Hollow, understanding would not come through steel. It would come through patience. Grey Hollow did not greet him. It endured him. The Witcher entered by the southern track where the mud gave way to worn cobble. The stones were old and uneven, laid by hands that had once believed permanence possible. Moss filled the cracks between them. No child's chalk marked their surface. No fresh wheel grooves cut across their lines. The air inside the village felt different from the marsh, yet not freer. Sound returned here in pieces, an axe striking wood somewhere beyond sight, a bucket set down carefully, the murmur of 2 women speaking behind a shutter. But even those sounds seemed cautious, measured. He walked without announcing himself. Witchers who made spectacle of a rival rarely learned what villages hid in their ordinary gestures. Better to let the place reveal itself. The first thing he noted was the absence. No dogs. There were kennels beside several homes, low timber frames with straw bedding. One had a bowl overturned neatly beside it. Another had chew marks along its edge, old and faded, but no animal barked, no chain clinked. He paused beside one kennel and crouched, and the straw inside was undisturbed, dry. No tracks circled it. If dogs had been taken, there would have been noise, blood, signs of struggle. If dogs had fled, there would have been tracks outward. Instead, there was nothing. He rose and continued. A woman across the square watched him through a crack in her door. When he turned slightly in her direction, she closed it without sound. The well stood covered, bucket resting atop its lid. No roke swayed in the morning air. Even the smoke from chimneys rose straight upward, undisturbed by wind. The Witcher moved along the narrow lane that led toward the stream cutting the village's edge. He saw a cart, left half repaired beside a shed. Tools lay arranged too neatly, as if their owner had intended to return, and had not. He stopped beside a patch of earth darker than the rest. Not blood, only dampness from recent washing. He touched it lightly and brought his fingers to his nose. Water, nothing more. The stream itself flowed sluggishly beneath a narrow wooden bridge. Normally, such places carried frogs, dragonflies, insects skimming across the surface. Today, it carried only reflection. He leaned against the bridge rail and watched the current. A ripple formed near the bank. He did not move. The ripple faded without shape. Perhaps a fish, perhaps nothing. He closed his eyes briefly and let his senses widen. A village breathed, but shallowly. Doors did not slam. Voices did not rise. The ordinary chaos of rural life had been trimmed into careful quiet. He stepped away from the stream and made his way toward the outer cottages nearest the marsh. Here the fog lingered longest. It pooled in corners where houses leaned close together, curling along roof edges like slow fingers. He stopped at the final cottage before open ground. Its door stood ajar, not broken, not forced, simply open. He waited. No sound came from within. He stepped to the threshold and looked inside without crossing. The interior was simple. Hearth, table, 2 chairs. A bowl rested on the table, half filled with hardened porridge. A spoon lay beside it. Dust had settled thinly across the surface. He studied the floor. No sign of struggle. No overturned furniture. No scrape marks. He did not step inside. Instead, he looked to the doorway's frame. There, faint as breath on glass, he saw something others would have missed. A thin line of soot, tracing the wood at shoulder height. Not recent, old, and intentional. A partial circle, broken. He stepped back slowly, binding magic. Again. Not active enough to stir his medallion fully. But present, like an echo that refused to fade. He moved along the outer wall of the cottage and looked toward the marsh. The fog there seemed thicker today than it had in the morning. It did not drift. It accumulated. He stood very still. There are moments when a Witcher recognizes being measured. This was one. No sound accompanied the sensation. No breath upon his neck. No shifting branch. Only the awareness that something within the fog had noted him in the same way he had noted it. He did not reach for his sword. Steel was for creatures of muscle and bone. Instead, he stepped forward 2 paces toward the marsh's edge and stopped. "I am not prey," he said quietly. The words fell into the mist and were swallowed without echo. He waited. Nothing answered. Yet the fog shifted slightly, receding a fraction from his boots. He studied that movement. Instinct, perhaps, or acknowledgement. After a moment, he turned and walked back toward the village center. As he passed a narrow alley between 2 cottages, he saw something else that tightened his focus. Footprints, small ones, leading into the alley, none leading out. He followed them with his eyes. They ended halfway between wall and wall. Not faded, not washed away, ended. He knelt and touched the final impression. The earth there was firm. No sinkhole, no trap, no illusion. Just a child's footprint, stopping as if the body that made it had ceased to exist. He remained crouched for several breaths. Higher vampires did not erase. Curses tied to individuals left anchors, graves, bones, tokens of grief. Specters howled. Wraiths chilled the air sharply enough to frost breath. This did none of that. It removed and left silence as the only evidence. He rose and stepped back into the main square. A door creaked open slightly as he passed. An old man peered out, pipe unlit between his lips. The Witcher did not speak. The investigation required patience before questions. He scanned the rooftops, the corners, the narrow paths between dwellings. He saw it then. The smallest detail, nearly invisible. Above the door of the tavern hung a small iron charm meant to ward minor spirits. It had been turned upside down, not by wind, deliberately. He walked toward it and studied the nail. Freshly hammered. Someone had reversed it in the last week. He did not touch it. Instead, he stepped back and let his gaze drift slowly across the square. Old binding sigils near the marsh. Partial soot circles at door frames. A charm reversed. Footprints that ended. And silence that pressed rather than settled. The contract was not about something that hunted the village. It was about something that had been invited, and perhaps long ago contained. The Witcher finally turned toward the house with the narrow blue shutters. The one the innkeep had pointed toward the night before. Elder Wylam's home. Questions would follow, but answers, he suspected, would not come from fear. They would come from history. And in Grey Hollow, history lay just beneath the floorboards, waiting to be uncovered. The fog at the village edge did not recede. It watched, and it waited. Elder Willem's house stood near the center of Grey Hollow, not larger than the others, but older. Its beams were darkened by decades of smoke. The shutters, painted once in blue, had faded toward gray. A small charm of braided straw hung beside the door, turned upright. Unlike the iron ward at the tavern, the Witcher knocked once. There was no hurried shuffling within. Only the steady approach of someone who had been expecting him. The door opened. Elder Willem was narrow and bent, his beard yellowed from pipe smoke, his eyes clear despite their age. He studied the Witcher without surprise. "You walked the edges first," the elder said quietly. "Yes." Willem nodded once, as if that answered something important. "Come inside." The room was simple and clean. A single candle burned at the table despite the daylight. Its flame did not flicker. The Witcher remained standing. "Tell it from the beginning," he said. Willem lowered himself into a chair slowly. He folded his hands and stared at them for a moment before speaking. "It began 3 winters ago," he said. "Not with disappearances, with a scholar." The Witcher did not interrupt. "He came from the south," Willem continued. "Not a mage, said he was only a historian. He asked about old stones near the marsh, asked if we had ruins." The Witcher's gaze did not shift. "There are no ruins," Willem said. "Only markers, old ones. The first settlers put them there. My grandfather told me so." "The scholar didn't believe that," the elder went on. "He stayed a month, walked the marsh, measured things, drew in books, asked about the war, about when the land changed hands, about graves. Willem's jaw tightened slightly. He paid well, kept to himself. The Witcher studied the candle flame. Who reversed the ward at the tavern? He asked after a moment. Wylem's eyes flickered. You saw that? Yes. The elder inhaled slowly. It was me. Why? Because I thought, Wylem said, that perhaps we had done something wrong. The Witcher did not respond. After the scholar vanished, Wylem continued. We found his books in his room. Most of them were harmless. Histories, maps, but one, he swallowed. One described old binding practices, not mage work, older, pre-conjunction things. The Witcher's gaze sharpened slightly. Details, he said. Wylem nodded. It spoke of entities not born of hunger. Not demons, not specters. Things that feed on presence. He hesitated on the word. They cannot manifest fully unless called, he continued. They remain thin. They draw strength by being noticed, by being invited. The Witcher's expression did not change. The scholar had drawn circles near the marsh, Wylem said. Broken ones. Yes. You saw them. Yes. Wylem's voice lowered. He believed there was something beneath Grey Hollow, not buried, bound long before our village stood here. The Witcher did not blink. He tried to study it, Wylem said. He tried to strengthen the binding, or weaken it. I do not know. And failed, the Witcher said. Wylem nodded. After the scholar's disappearance, he continued. We burned those books. We burned his notes. We thought that would end him. It did not. No. The candle flame wavered faintly then, though no draft touched the room. The Witcher did not look at it. Tell me about the first true disappearance. He said. The miller's boy, Wylem replied. He said he heard his sister calling from the marsh. And she was not there. No. Did he step into the fog? Yes. Was he alone? For a moment. Wylem's voice thinned. His father stood behind him, said the boy walked 3 paces, and dimmed. The Witcher's eyes narrowed slightly. Dimmed. As if the fog swallowed his edges, Wylem said, and then he was simply not. The candle guttered once and steadied. After that, Wylem continued, we forbade anyone from answering voices at night. We kept doors barred. We left candles burning. The Witcher's gaze shifted briefly to the flame on the table. It does not like flame, Wylem said quietly. It retreats from bright light, but it does not burn. The Witcher absorbed this without visible reaction. Why call for Witchers? He asked. Because this is not a priest's work, Wylem said, and not ours. 2 came, the Witcher said. Yes. What did they say? The first said it was not a beast. The second said he had seen something like this once, in Toussaint, but weaker. He said ours was older. The Witcher was silent. Why did they leave? He asked. Wylem's gaze did not waver. They said killing it might free it. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a door shut somewhere across the square. The Witcher finally moved. He stepped closer to the table and studied the candle flame from a hand's breadth away. It feeds on attention, he said slowly, on acknowledgement, on invitation. Wylem nodded. Yes. And the scholar strengthened the tether, the Witcher said, or thinned it. Yes. And when villagers answer voices, they give it shape. Silence settled again. The Witcher straightened. Has it taken anyone from within a closed room? He asked. No. From within bright light? From within a crowd? No. The Witcher inclined his head once. Good. Willem's brows knit slightly. Good? He asked. It had rules, the Witcher said. The elder stared at him. That comforts you? It gives me something to break, the Witcher replied. The candle flame flickered once more, briefly leaning toward the door. Neither man turned. The contract had not been refused because the thing was invincible. It had been refused because it required patience, not steel. And patience was rarer among Witchers than courage. The Witcher looked down at Elder Willem. Show me where the scholar stayed, he said. Willem rose slowly. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the village's edges. But inside the elder's house, the candle burned steadily, for now. The scholar had lodged in a narrow house near the stream, one of the older structures in Grey Hollow. Its roof sagged slightly in the center, and its stone foundation bore faint cracks filled with moss. The door opened with a reluctant creak, as though it had not been persuaded often in recent months. Inside, the air was dry. Dust lay evenly across the table and shelves, undisturbed except for a narrow path between door and bed. The window shutters were closed, yet a thin seam of daylight slipped through, pale and reluctant. The Witcher did not step immediately into the room. He stood at the threshold and allowed his senses to move ahead of him. No chill distinct from ordinary stone-cold air. No scent of decay, no tremor in his medallion. He crossed the threshold deliberately. The bed remained neatly made. The blankets were folded back once and left that way, as if the scholar had intended to return before nightfall. A single ink-stained cloth lay draped across the chair. On the table rested the remains of careful study. A wooden ruler, a charcoal stick worn nearly to nothing, several loose pages, blank now, where ink had once been burned away. The Witcher touched one gently. The edges curled inward, blackened, burned intentionally. The grain of the wood beneath the paper bore faint scorch marks in the shape of a circle, broken at one point. He moved slowly around the table, examining the floorboards. There were no signs of struggle. The dust pattern suggested the scholar had moved frequently between table and shelf, but not beyond. He crouched and studied the boards beneath the bed. There, nearly hidden by shadow, lay a faint ring of white residue, salt, spread in a partial circle, broken. He traced the gap in the line, deliberate, not worn away. The Witcher rose and crossed to the shelves. Most books were ordinary, histories of the northern kingdoms, treatises on pre-conjunction folklore, agricultural records. Several volumes bore the faint discoloration of having been near flame. One shelf, however, held a single object apart from the rest, a small leather journal. Its edges were scorched but not fully consumed. He lifted it carefully. The leather felt brittle but intact. Inside, many pages had been torn free. Others bore writing faded to near illegibility. He did not attempt to read every word. Instead, he looked for patterns, circles drawn repeatedly in margins, annotations beside them, small arrows pointing outward. One page, spared from burning perhaps by accident, contained a sketch, a rough map of Grey Hollow. At the marsh's edge was marked a point labeled only with a single word, threshold. Beneath it, in cramped script, another phrase, not bound beneath, bound between. The Witcher closed the journal and set it back exactly where it had rested. He stepped toward the window and pushed the shutter open slightly. Fog pressed against the glass like damp cloth. He watched the way it moved. It did not roll or drift. It held, as if the space between air and earth had thickened. He stepped back from the window. On the far wall hung a small iron nail driven deep into the timber. No charm hung from it now, only the mark where something once had. He examined the wall closely. A faint circular discoloration marked where an object had rested for some time. Round, metal, likely a ward, removed. He crouched once more and examined the space near the hearth. Ash had been cleared carefully long ago, but one section of stone bore faint scoring. A blade had scraped there repeatedly, not in panic, in practice. The scholar had drawn circles in ash upon that stone, again and again, testing shape, testing boundary. The Witcher stood slowly and removed his glove. He placed his palm flat against the center of the room. The wood beneath felt ordinary, yet something about the space pressed faintly against his senses, not as an active presence, but as absence, a thinness, as if the room itself had once held more weight. He closed his eyes, and a medallion at his throat trembled faintly once, not sharply, like the memory of vibration. He exhaled slowly. The scholar had not summoned something from beneath the marsh. He had disturbed something already present, bound between, not under, not over, between. The Witcher opened his eyes and stepped back from the center of the room. He studied the doorway. Its frame bore faint traces of soot at shoulder height, similar to the cottage near the marsh. A broken circle had been drawn there once, protection from entry or containment within. He stepped outside and examined the exterior wall. There, beneath creeping ivy, lay another sigil, older than the scholar's markings, weathered nearly to invisibility, carved, not drawn. He brushed moss aside carefully. The shape was incomplete, as if deliberately damaged centuries ago. Binding required 2 parts, anchor and consent. The scholar had tampered with the anchor. The villagers, unknowingly, had supplied the consent. Answering voices, opening doors, stepping into fog. The Witcher turned slowly in the yard outside the scholar's room. The stream ran nearby, quiet and untroubled. A dragonfly hovered briefly above its surface, then veered sharply away from the marsh's direction. He noted that creatures did not remain near thin places for long. He stepped back inside one final time. In the corner, nearly invisible, lay a small object half hidden beneath dust. A shard of mirror, its surface clouded. He lifted it. The reflection it offered was dimmer than it should have been. Not distorted, diminished. He angled it toward the doorway. The fog beyond appeared thinner in the mirror's surface than in reality. He turned it slightly. The room behind him seemed deeper than it was. He lowered the shard. Mirrors did not lie. They revealed absence. He placed the shard carefully into his pouch. Not as a trophy, as a tool. The scholar had believed knowledge would strengthen the tether. Instead, it had thinned it. The entity bound between spaces did not hunt like a beast. It did not feed like a vampire. It eroded, and once acknowledged fully, once invited without caution, it could slip through the break in the circle. The Witcher stepped outside and closed the door behind him gently. The house did not feel haunted. It felt unfinished. The fog beyond the village shifted faintly again, pooling along the marsh's edge. Dusk would come soon, and dusk, he now understood, was when boundaries thinned further. He turned toward the square, boots steadied on cobble. Steel would not end this. Knowing with simple words, what had been bound between would need to be defined again. And to define it, he would have to stand at the threshold himself. Not to fight, but to refuse acknowledgement. The mirror shard rested cold against his palm inside the pouch. The village remained quiet, but now the silence felt less like mystery and more like expectation. Dusk did not fall over Grey Hollow. It gathered. The light thinned gradually, as if drawn outward into the marsh. The village lamps were lit earlier than usual. Doors closed with soft, final sounds. Smoke lowered and spread rather than rising cleanly into the air. The Witcher walked alone toward the marsh's edge. He carried no torch. Flame comforted villagers. It did not solve what waited between. The sky above was a dull pewter. The sun hidden behind a bank of low cloud. The fog thickened as he neared the outer cottages, sliding along fences and pooling in hollows like water seeking shape. He stopped at the final tree before the reeds began. The broken binding circle, carved into the old stone marker, lay a few paces ahead. He waited. Dusk was not merely dimmer light. It was the narrowing of definition. Edges softened, distance misled. The line between form and suggestion blurred. The Witcher removed the shard of mirror from his pouch and held it low at his side. The marsh lay still. No frogs called. No insects stitched the air with sound. He stepped forward one pace beyond the carved marker. The medallion at his throat tightened, not vibrating, but pressing faintly against his skin. He breathed slowly. The fog before him thickened, but not by drift. It accumulated in a shallow depression between reeds, exactly where he had seen a pool before. He did not draw his sword. Instead, he shifted the mirror shard upward, angling it toward the gathering mist. In the reflection, the fog did not appear dense. It appeared stretched, as if something within it pulled the light inward. The Witcher watched without blinking. A faint shape suggested itself. Not a body, not limbs, but a thinning of reality, like heat shimmer above stone, but colder. He did not step closer. He did not speak. The first mistake villagers had made was acknowledgement. The second was invitation. The third would have been fear. He offered none. The fog crept nearer his boots. He remained still. In the mirror's surface, something altered. The depression in the reeds appeared deeper than it should have been, as if the ground itself dipped away into shadow, bound between, not beneath, not above, between the seen and the noticed. The Witcher lowered the mirror slightly and closed his eyes. He let his hearing extend outward. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, a sound, soft, so soft it might have been memory. A voice calling a name, not his, someone else's, a woman's voice, faint and familiar in tone, though he did not recognize it. He did not open his eyes. The voice came again, nearer, calling gently. He knew this pattern. It was not command, it was invitation. He exhaled and focused on the rhythm of his own breath. The voice shifted. Now it carried the faint timbre of an older man, then a child, then silence. When he opened his eyes again, the fog had moved closer still, curling around his boots. The medallion tightened once more. He lifted the mirror shard again. In the reflection, the shape was clearer, not because it had gained form, but because the absence around it had deepened. A hollow within mist. He stepped one pace backward. The fog advanced. He stepped another pace. It followed. The broken circle carved into the stone marker lay just behind his heel. He turned slightly, positioning himself so that the carved sigil lay between him and the densest mist. The fog hesitated, not recoiled, hesitated. The Witcher crouched and placed his palm flat upon the carved stone. The sigil was incomplete, damaged long ago, but intention lingered in its sill. He closed his eyes once more and let his mind narrow to a single focus. Boundary, not fear, not anger, definition. He opened his eyes and looked directly into the densest point of fog. "I see you," he said quietly. The words did not echo. They did not carry far, but they were deliberate. In the mirror shard, the hollow shape shifted. The fog around it tightened, compressing. The Witcher did not step forward. He did not grant it more space. The voice came again, closer now. It carried a new tone, familiarity tailored for him. A calm, level voice, like an old mentor correcting his stance by firelight. He did not respond. He raised the mirror higher, holding it at chest height. In the reflection, the hollow thinned sharply, as if pressed by invisible hands. It recoiled from the mirrored surface, not violently, but distinctly. Light defined it, recognition constrained it. The Witcher took one slow step forward this time. The fog retreated a fraction. He stopped at the broken edge of the carved circle. The marsh air grew colder. The reeds nearest him bent slightly inward, though no wind moved them. The hollow shape stretched upward, rising faintly within the mist. Not tall, not monstrous, but elongated, as if testing height. The Witcher remained still. He did not draw steel. Steel could not cut absence. Instead, he knelt and removed from his pouch a small vial of powdered silver mixed with salt. He poured a thin line along the broken portion of the carved circle. Not to trap, to complete. The line glimmered faint. The medallion trembled once, stronger now. The fog pressed against the completed boundary. It did not cross. In the mirror shard, the hollow thinned further. The voice did not return. Silence deepened, but now the silence felt strained. The Witcher stood slowly. He did not attempt further action. Dusk was nearly spent. Full night would alter conditions. He would not rush binding work in failing light. He stepped back from the completed circle and lowered the mirror. The fog remained pooled beyond the boundary. It did not disperse, but it did not advance further, for now. He turned and walked back toward the village without looking behind him. At the edge of Grey Hollow, he paused once and listened. The ordinary sounds of evening, low voices, a door closing, a pot placed upon a hearth, reached him clearly. The boundary had held, partially, but the entity was not confined solely to that carved marker. It existed in acknowledgement, in thresholds, in spaces between door and outside, between name called and answer given. Completing the circle in the marsh had slowed it. It had not ended it. The Witcher slipped the mirror shard back into his pouch. Night would bring a different test. And to finish what the scholar had thinned, he would have to stand not at the marsh, but at a doorway where consent was given and refused. The fog remained at the village edge, waiting. Night settled fully over Grey Hollow, and with it came the kind of quiet that pressed against walls. Lanterns burned in nearly every window. Candlelight pooled on wooden floors. Families gathered close to hearths, speaking in low tones that did not rise into laughter. Outside, the fog lay thick beyond the final cottages, but within the village proper, it hovered only in thin strands, waiting in corners, coiling along gutters. The Witcher did not take a room. He walked the narrow lanes as darkness deepened, boots soft against cobble, cloak unmoving in the windless air. He listened. The medallion at his throat lay still, but not dormant. It felt alert. He paused near the stream and watched the surface of the water. No ripples disturbed it. Even the current seemed muted beneath the weight of night. Then, faintly, a voice, soft, carried not by wind, but by suggestion. It did not call loudly. It murmured. From a house near the square came the sound of movement. A chair scraping, footsteps crossing floorboards. The Witcher turned. Light glowed beneath the cottage door, the one belonging to a cooper whose wife had vanished 2 months prior. The door latch lifted, slowly. The Witcher moved without haste, but without delay. The door opened a hand's breadth. Within the house stood the cooper, eyes unfocused, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something just beyond hearing. Marith, the man whispered. The name drifted into the street and dissolved. The Witcher stepped onto the threshold, but did not cross it. Close the door, he said calmly. The cooper did not turn. Maris, he whispered again, taking one small step forward. The Witcher placed a gloved hand flat against the outside of the door, preventing it from opening wider. The air beyond the threshold felt thinner. The fog had gathered along the opposite side of the lane, subtle but present. From within that faint mist came the softest suggestion of reply. Not a full voice, only breath shaped into memory. The Cooper leaned forward. The Witcher did not raise his voice. "Your wife is not outside," he said evenly. The Cooper's eyes blinked once, slowly, as if surfacing from deep water. The voice came again, this time clearer, not calling the man's name, calling something smaller, a pet name, private. The Cooper's hand reached for the doorframe. The Witcher withdrew the mirror shard from his pouch with his free hand and angled it toward the fog across the lane. In the mirror's surface, the air beyond the door appeared hollowed, a faint finning, stretching toward the threshold. He held the mirror steady. The Cooper's breathing quickened. The fog crept one fraction closer. The Witcher lowered his voice further. "She does not stand there." The Cooper's fingers tightened on the wood. A step forward, the Witcher moved faster now, but still without suddenness. He stepped fully into the doorway and placed his hand against the Cooper's chest. Firm, grounded. "Look at me," he said. The Cooper's gaze shifted reluctantly. The Witcher raised the mirror shard between them so that the man saw not the fog outside, but his own reflection, dimmed slightly by the clouded glass. "Breathe," the Witcher instructed. The Cooper inhaled sharply. The voice outside shifted again, now urgent, now pleading. The fog pressed against the far wall of the lane. The Witcher held his ground. He lifted his other hand and drew a quick sign in the air before the threshold. Quen, not to shield from attack, but to fortify space. A faint golden shimmer settled over the doorway, subtle and brief. The fog halted. The Cooper swayed once, then the tension in his shoulders broke. He blinked rapidly and looked beyond the Witcher toward the empty street. There was nothing there. Only fog. Only night. He stepped backward into his house, breath ragged. The Witcher closed the door firmly and slid the wooden bolt into place. He remained standing inside the cottage for several long breaths. The Cooper's chest rose and fell unevenly. The hearth flame flickered, though no draft stirred. The Witcher glanced toward the shuttered window. Outside, the fog thinned slightly. Retreating, not defeated, denied. He stepped back into the lane and remained there. The night felt different now, not heavier, more alert, as if the entity had tested a boundary and met resistance. Across the square, a second house creaked faintly. He turned at once. A shutter opened 2 fingers' width. A child's face peered out. The Witcher lifted his gaze and held it steady. The child blinked, then slowly closed the shutter again. The medallion at his throat gave a faint tremor. The entity moved between houses now, testing, seeking invitation. He walked to the center of the square and stood where 4 lanes met. He did not draw his sword. He did not shout warnings. He simply stood. The fog along the outer cottages shifted. Once, twice. The Witcher removed the vial of silver salt mixture again and poured a thin line across the entrance to one narrow alley where the child's footprints had ended earlier. The line glimmered faintly in lantern light. He repeated the motion at 2 more intersections. Not full circles, threshold marks, definitions. The air tightened slightly as each line settled. The fog retreated a pace further toward the village edge. Silence deepened, but now it was no longer oppressive. It was held at bay. After several long minutes, no further voices came. No doors lifted, no latches stirred. The Witcher remained in the square until the moon rose faintly behind clouds. Only then did he lower his hands. The entity had grown bold enough to attempt entry. That meant the tether was weakening further. Completing the broken circle at the marsh had limited its expansion, but it still reached through thresholds where consent wavered. He understood now. It did not drag bodies away. It drew them across boundaries willingly. Once across, they were no longer within the same definition of place. Erased, not consumed, not slain, simply unanchored. The Witcher looked toward the marsh. The fog there lay thicker than before, though it no longer crept inward. For tonight, the boundary held, but the entity would test again, and each attempt would grow more precise. He slipped the mirror shard back into his pouch and walked once more along the perimeter of Grey Hollow. Doors remained closed. Candles burned. The village breathed shallowly, but together. He would not be able to guard every threshold forever. Tomorrow, he would have to redefine the tether entirely. Not merely slow it, unmake the broken consent that fed it. The night passed without further incident, but the Witcher did not mistake stillness for safety. He had felt it stretch, and it had felt him. Morning came thin and colorless. Grey Hollow stirred cautiously, as if uncertain whether the night had truly passed. Doors opened in measured increments. Candles were extinguished one by one. Faces appeared in windows, searching the lanes for absence. No one was missing. For the first time in many nights, the village exhaled. The Witcher did not share the relief. He stood near the stream, where frost still clung to shaded stones, and watched the fog recede toward the marsh in slow withdrawal. It did not disperse like ordinary mist. It folded into itself, gathering in the lowlands beyond the final cottages. He turned the mirror shard in his hand. The near disappearance had confirmed what he suspected. The entity did not cross thresholds uninvited. It pressed. It coaxed. It thinned the barrier between presence and absence until a single step dissolved the boundary. Completing the broken circle at the marsh had slowed it. Marking doorways had forced it back. But these were temporary gestures. The scholar's interference had altered the tether. To restore the binding fully would require undoing what had been disturbed. And that carried risk. The Witcher walked again to the carved stone marker near the marsh's edge. The silver salt line he had poured at dusk remained intact. No animal had disturbed it. No rain had washed it thin. The fog beyond it lay dense but motionless. He crouched and examined the carved sigil more closely. The damage to the circle had not been recent. The chisel marks were worn, the edges smoothed by seasons of frost and thaw. Whoever had first bound the entity had done so long ago. Long before Grey Hollow, long before the conjunction had blurred the lines between worlds. Pre-conjunction texts spoke rarely of such bindings. Entities not born of flesh or hunger. Not demons, not specters, conceptual presences. They fed on awareness. They gained shape through acknowledgement. The scholar had likely attempted to strengthen the anchor, perhaps believing knowledge would reinforce containment. Instead, he had redefined the boundary. Not under, not over, between. The Witcher traced the broken portion of the carved circle with a gloved finger. To restore it fully, he would have to complete the design not only in stone, but in meaning. Finding magic required two conditions: recognition of the thing's nature and agreement upon its limits. The villagers had unknowingly agreed to its presence by answering its voices, by stepping into fog, by believing it could be spoken to. To unbind it fully, to strip away its tether, would force it into one of two states: contained entirely or freed entirely. He closed his eyes briefly. Freed entirely would not mean unleashed in the way a fiend might rampage through fields. It would mean undefined, without anchor, without threshold, no longer limited to the marsh or to Grey Hollow. It could thin reality wherever acknowledgement existed. In any village, in any doorway, he opened his eyes. The fog shifted faintly in response to his focus. He did not step forward. He withdrew the mirror shard once more and angled it toward the densest part of the mist. In the reflection, the hollow shape seemed smaller than the night before, compressed, constrained by the temporary marks he had set, but also alert, as if aware that its tether was under scrutiny. He lowered the mirror. The danger lay not in combat. Steel would never touch it. Signs could repel, but not define. The only way to end it would be to remove its between state. Force it to choose, bound or dispersed. If bound, it would retreat into the carved anger permanently, unable to stretch beyond it again. If dispersed, the Witcher did not finish the thought. He stood and turned toward the village. Elder Whelan watched him from a distance, though he did not approach. The Witcher did not offer explanation. This was not a matter villagers could influence further. The tether had been thinned by curiosity and by fear. It would be repaired or shattered by intention. He walked slowly back into Grey Hollow and studied each doorway here marked with silver salt. The lines remained visible, faintly glinting in morning light. Temporary. Definitions must be sustained. He paused at the Cooper's house. The door remained closed. No voice murmured within. He stepped back and considered the village as a whole. To unbind fully would require drawing the entity to a singular point, the original anchor, the carved marker near the marsh. He would need to erase the broken boundary entirely and redraw it whole, not in stone alone, but in awareness. He would need to confront it directly at dusk once more, invite it, name it, and deny it. That was the risk. To invite it deliberately, even for the purpose of containment, meant granting it acknowledgement stronger than any villager had offered. It would stretch toward him fully, test the limits. If he faltered, if he answered the wrong voice, if he accepted even a fragment of its suggested reality, the boundary would collapse, and the between would widen. The Witcher's medallion lay still now, but he felt its weight more keenly than before. He had faced higher vampires who hid among courts. He had lifted curses woven through generations of grief. He had slain creatures born of rot and rage. Those were battles of endurance and steel. This was a matter of definition and of restraint. He turned once more toward the marsh. The fog did not advance, but it did not disperse either. It waited, as it had waited for the scholar, as it had waited for villagers to listen. Tonight he would stand at the threshold intentionally, not as prey, not as challenger, as boundary. If he succeeded, Grey Hollow would wake to ordinary silence once more. Wind in reeds, dogs barking at dawn, frogs stitching the stream with sound. If he failed, the contract would not remain pinned to a single post. It would hang everywhere, unseen. He walked toward the center of the village, boots steady. The day would pass slowly, and dusk would decide whether the tether held, or whether the thing bound between spaces would learn how to step beyond them entirely. Dusk returned like a held breath, released slowly. The village shuttered itself early. Candles burned behind every pane. Even the stream seemed to draw inward, its surface flattening beneath the gathering gray. The Witcher stood alone at the carved marker near the marsh. He had erased the temporary silver salt line. The broken circle lay exposed once more. The mirror shard rested in his left hand. In his right, a small pouch of powdered silver and crushed rowan bark. The fog beyond the reeds thickened in answer to his presence. It did not rush. It assembled. The sky dimmed until land and air shared the same shade. He stepped forward, placing both boots inside the broken circle. The medallion at his throat tightened sharply for the first time. He did not flinch. The fog surged inward, not violently, but with intent. It pressed against the edges of the carved stone as water presses against a dam. The Witcher knelt and drew the first arc of silver salt along the broken portion. The line glowed faintly in the failing light. The fog recoiled, then stretched taller. In the mirror's surface, the hollow shape expanded vertically, thinning as it rose, like a column of distorted air bending the world around it. The reeds nearest him bowed inward, though no wind moved. The ground beneath his boots felt subtly uneven, as if the earth had softened into suggestion. He finished the arc. The circle was whole. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the world distorted. The horizon bent slightly, as though viewed through curved glass. The marsh seemed deeper than it was, its pools widening into dark wells without bottom. The fog coiled upward around him, forming shifting corridors of pale density. Within those corridors flickered shapes, not bodies, memories. A child running through reeds, a scholar kneeling over drawn circles, a woman turning toward a doorway at night. Each image incomplete, each suggestion thin as breath. The Witcher remained at the center of the completed circle. The medallion vibrated steadily now, no longer faint. The fog's column condensed before him. In the mirror shard, the hollow shape filled nearly the entire surface. The world around the circle elongated. Trees leaned inward at impossible angles. The stream's surface curved upward like a tilted mirror. The entity did not roar. It did not hiss. It pressed. The air thinned sharply. Sound warped. The Witcher heard voices layered over one another, 10 at least, each familiar in tone but not in truth. They called names. They called promises. They offered reunion. He did not respond. He lifted the mirror higher, holding it directly before the densest part of the column. In its surface, the distortion clarified. The hollow had no center. It was absence shaped by expectation. The Witcher spoke, not loudly, but with precise cadence. You are bound to this threshold. The fog tightened. The voices shifted tone, less coaxing, more insistent. The marsh beyond the circle stretched unnaturally wide, as if distance had multiplied. The carved stone beneath his boots grew cold. He continued, You are not hunger. The voices faltered. You are not grief. The distortion flickered. The fog surged forward, pressing against the completed silver arc. The line glowed brighter. The world beyond it rippled like disturbed water. The Witcher's breathing slowed deliberately. The entity attempted to redefine him. The mirror's surface clouded. For a fraction of a second, his own reflection blurred, edges softening. He tightened his grip. I define you, he said evenly. You exist at the boundary. The fog compressed violently inward, narrowing the column until it stood no wider than a man. Within it, shapes flickered more clearly, faces without detail, mouths forming silent words. The air felt stretched thin enough to tear. The Witcher reached into the pouch and cast the remaining silver salt mixture upward. It hung suspended in the distorted air for a heartbeat before settling along the invisible contours of the column. The circle's boundary pulsed faintly. The distortion intensified. The sky above seemed to bend downward, lowering toward the marsh. For an instant, the Witcher saw not Grey Hollow, but an endless field of thresholds, Doorways without walls, paths without earth. Between, the entity surged again, seeking expansion. The circle held. The Witcher stepped forward within the boundary, not out of it, and placed his palm flat against the densest portion of fog. Cold, but not wet. Resistance, but not solid. He did not push. He named, "You're held." The mirror shard in his other hand reflected only light now, no hollow. The column trembled. The voices overlapped into a single string tone. Then they ceased. The distortion snapped inward. The horizon straightened. The trees returned to natural angle. The stream resumed its ordinary width. The fog collapsed into the carved circle, like breath drawn sharply through clenched teeth. The silver arc flared once, bright enough to sting the eyes, then dimmed. Silence followed, not strained, not pressing, ordinary. Wind moved at last through reeds. A frog called from a distant pool. The Witcher remained kneeling, palms still resting against cold air. The medallion slowed its vibration. Gradually, it lay still. The carved circle beneath his boots bore faint new scoring, as if etched from within. The silver line had darkened, fused lightly with stone. The boundary was no longer broken. The fog beyond the marsh thinned naturally, dispersing with evening wind. No hollow shape lingered in the mirror, only reflection. The Witcher lowered his hand and stood slowly. He did not look triumphant. He looked steady. The between had been defined, not destroyed, not freed, contained where it had first been bound. He stepped backward out of the circle. The air felt whole again. From the edge of the village, lantern light flickered cautiously. No voices called from the fog. No door latches lifted. The Witcher slipped the mirror shard back into his pouch. The contract had never been about slaying a monster. It had been about restoring a boundary forgotten by curiosity and fear. The marsh lay quiet beneath deepening night. And for the first time in many months, its silence was natural. Morning came gently to Gray Hollow. Not thin and colorless as before, but pale in the ordinary way of northern dawns. The fog that lingered above the marsh drifted apart beneath a small but honest wind. It did not gather. It did not press. It simply lifted. The first sound was not human. A dog barked, short, sharp, indignant at nothing in particular. A second answered from across the square. Doors opened more quickly than they had in weeks. Shutters swung wide. Smoke rose freely, not clinging to rooftops, but rising clean into the morning air. The Witcher stood at the edge of the marsh and watched as light settled fully across the reeds. The carved stone marker lay unchanged in appearance, yet the boundary it marked felt solid now, anchored not only in symbol, but in definition. The circle was whole. Wind moved through grass and carried the smell of wet earth and pine. Frogs called in irregular rhythm from shallow pools. A dragonfly skimmed the surface of the stream and did not veer away. The Witcher listened carefully. There was silence still, but it was the natural silence of early day, broken by ordinary sound, not the strained absence that pressed against Lot. He turned toward the village. Elder Willem stood near the square, hands clasped behind his back, watching children step cautiously into the lane, as if testing whether ground still held. A woman laughed softly when her goat tugged free of its rope and bolted a few steps before being caught. The contract notice still hung upon the tavern post. The parchment was damp and curling at the edges. He walked to it and studied the charcoal lettering once more. Contract, Gray Hollow, disappearances. The words no longer carried weight. He removed the parchment carefully from the nail. For a moment, he held it between his fingers. Then he folded it once and placed it into his pouch. Not as proof, as reminder. The village would remember this season for years. Children would grow and speak of the nights when fog pressed too close. They would warn their own not to answer voices beyond doors. But fear would fade, and ordinary life would settle back into its quiet routines. The Witcher walked toward the southern track as the sun lifted higher above the trees. Behind him, dogs barked freely. A hammer struck metal somewhere near the tavern. Wind moved without resistance across open ground. At the edge of Gray Hollow, he paused once more and looked back. The marsh lay calm beneath open sky. No column of distortion lingered. No hollow thinned the air. Only reeds bending in breeze and water reflecting light. He adjusted his gloves and stepped onto the road. The continent held many contracts, some written in ink, others in fear. Not all required steel. Some required patience. Some required standing still, where others stepped forward too quickly. The road stretched ahead in quiet lines of earth and stone. He did not hurry. There would be other villages, other thresholds. But for now, Gray Hollow breathed easily again. And the silence that followed him down the road was no longer strained, only peaceful.